Hello. Today's story is one of those that makes even the most convinced skeptics doubt that we know everything about this world. This story is not just about a missing person. It is a story about a discovery that formed the basis of a classified police report and about footprints in the snow that no forensic scientist has yet been able to identify. We travel back to January 2007 to the snow-covered forests of southern Oregon, where the chilling horror turned out to be more real than the bitter cold itself. There, amid the silent stillness, the body of an experienced hunter was found, a body without a head, and the only witnesses to his last moments were the tracks left in the snow by a creature that moved, sometimes on two legs like a human, and sometimes on four like a beast. This story begins on January 15th, 2007. 47-year-old Ethan Miller, an engineer from Eugene, was a man who seemed to have been born out of time. He preferred the silence of the forest to the hustle and bustle of the big city, and tracking game by its tracks to off his routine. Hunting was not just a hobby for him, but a real passion and a way of connecting with nature. He knew Rogue River National Forest like the back of his hand. Every trail, every ravine, every place where deer or elk could be found. His wife, Laura Miller, later told investigators that Ethan could disappear into the woods for hours and always come back with prey, or at least stories. He was extremely cautious, never took unnecessary risks, and always carried everything he needed: a powerful Remington 700 rifle, a radio tuned to the emergency frequency, and a survival kit. That Saturday morning, as usual, he kissed his wife goodbye and promised to be back by sunset. The weather was perfect for winter hunting, a light frost around -10 degrees Celsius and fresh, untouched snow that had fallen the night before. Ideal conditions for reading tracks. Laura began to worry when the clock struck 7 in the evening. The sun had long since set, and Ethan's old pickup truck had not yet appeared on the driveway. At first, she dismissed her fears. Ethan was an experienced hunter. He could get carried away chasing an animal and lose track of time. He could have simply waited somewhere in ambush. But when another 2 hours passed and the radio in the house remained silent, her anxiety turned into real fear. There was virtually no cell phone coverage in those forest areas in the year 2007, and the radio was the only way to contact her husband. But her calls were answered only by the dead hiss of static. At 10 p.m., unable to bear the tension any longer, Laura called the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. The officer on duty took the call, but immediately explained that a full-scale search in the nighttime forest in freezing temperatures and deep snow would be too dangerous for the rescuers themselves. He assured Mrs. Miller that the first team would be on site at dawn. Laura spent the night sleepless, staring out the dark window and listening to every sound, hoping to hear the sound of a pickup truck approaching. At dawn on January 16th, the search operation began. Ethan's pickup truck was found quickly. It was parked at one of the unofficial entrances to the forest, which was often used by local hunters. Next to the car, clear ski tracks were visible in the snow. They were Ethan's tracks. They led straight into the forest, smooth and confident. The search party, consisting of deputy sheriffs and several volunteer hunters who knew the area, set off on the trail. The first few miles raised no concerns. The tracks were steady, showing that the man was not in a hurry and was looking around carefully. He was clearly tracking game. After about 3 miles, the group came across the first strange circumstance. To the left of the ski trail, about 20 meters away, lay the carcass of a large, male deer. At first glance, nothing unusual for a winter forest. But when one of the volunteers, an old hunter named Bob, got closer, he stopped dead in his tracks. The deer was dead, but not from a gunshot. Its neck and side had been torn apart with incredible force. It didn't look like the work of a pack of wolves. They usually leave multiple bite marks as they tear at their prey. Nor did it look like a bear attack. The wounds were ragged, as if someone had dug huge claws into the flesh and simply torn out chunks of meat. The strangest thing was that most of the carcass remained untouched. The predator did not kill for hunger. It simply killed. Bob would later say in his report that in 40 years of hunting, he had never seen anything like it. It was like a senseless, violent rampage. The searchers exchanged worried glances and moved on. Ethan skied track passed by the dead deer. Judging by the tracks he had seen, it too, his skis stopped for a moment, and then the trail continued, but at a slightly different, faster pace. It seemed that this discovery had made him alert and quick in his step. He was no longer walking slowly, tracking his prey. Now he was moving purposefully. Somewhere, another half-mile later, the trail led the group to a small, snow-covered clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. And here, the scene that met their eyes silenced even the most experienced searchers. Ethan Miller's ski trail ended right in the middle of the clearing. It just ended, and around it was what one of the officers would later call a scene of pure chaos. His Remington 700 rifle lay in the snow. Its thick wooden stock was broken in, half like a matchstick. The metal barrel was bent at an unnatural angle. It would have taken superhuman strength to do that to a weapon made of hardened steel. Nearby lay the remains of his backpack, torn to shreds, and one glove. The snow around him was trampled, but not in the way it would be if two people had been fighting. This was something else. Among Ethan's own boot prints, other tracks were visible, tracks that made the blood run cold in the veins of everyone present. They were the prints of huge, bare feet, about 14 inches long, roughly 35 centimeters, but the shape was completely abnormal. The heel was unnaturally narrow and the toes were long with a deep mark from a claw digging into the frozen ground, clearly imprinted at the end of each one. The creature that left them stood on two legs. 2 chains of these footprints were visible in the snow. The distance between the steps was enormous, almost 2 meters, which spoke to the incredible height and strength of the creature that left them. But that wasn't the most frightening thing. In some places, the tracks changed. The 2-legged gait suddenly gave way to 4-legged prints. The rear paw prints were joined by front paw prints, similar to those of a huge dog or wolf, but again, with those eerie long fingers and claws. The creature could move like both a human and an animal. A deep furrow stretched across the snow. From the place where the rifle had been broken, it was as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. Next to the furrow was a chain of these monstrous tracks, now only on 2 legs. One of the deputy sheriffs, a young guy who was involved in such an operation for the first time, couldn't take it and threw up right there in the snow. The team leader, a gray-haired and imperturbable veteran, contacted the station by radio. His voice was tense and quiet. He reported that they had found the site of the alleged attack and were following a trail that led deep into the forest. He did not go into detail about the nature of the tracks over the open channel. He simply said, "Send the coroner here and tell the sheriff to come himself. He needs to see this." The group, weapons at the ready, slowly moved along the furrow in the snow, peering into the dark thicket from where something ancient and completely alien to human understanding seemed to be watching them. The search party followed the trail for about 50 yards. 50 yards of absolute, ringing silence, broken only by the crunch of snow under their boots and their heavy breathing, which escaped in clouds of steam. The forest here was denser, with centuries-old pines standing so close. Together they almost blocked out the daylight, creating an oppressive gloom. The furrow in the snow left by the dragged body led straight to the foot of a large, snow-covered boulder, and there the trail ended. What they saw remained etched in each of their memories forever. Ethan Miller's body lay on its side, leaning against the rock. His orange hunting vest was torn to shreds, exposing his chest. 3 deep parallel wounds were visible on his torso. They were not bites or cuts. The edges of the wounds were jagged, as if giant claws had dug into the flesh and pulled down with incredible force, tearing muscles and breaking ribs. The snow beneath the body was soaked with dark blood, frozen in the cold. But that wasn't the worst of it. The body had been decapitated. Where the neck should have been, there was a gaping wound. The head was nowhere to be found. One of the volunteers, a young man, recoiled and fell backward, stifling a scream. The team leader, keeping his composure, ordered everyone to stay where they were and not touch anything. He contacted the station again. This time, there was not a trace of calm in his voice. In short, abrupt phrases, he reported the discovery. Body found. Victim, Ethan Miller. There are signs of violent death of an extremely unusual nature. I repeat, extremely unusual. He walked around the site several times, carefully examining the traces. Monstrous footprints were everywhere. They surrounded the boulder, converging and diverging. It was obvious that the creature had not simply killed Miller and dragged him here. It had remained here for some time. What it had been doing, no one could even guess. An hour later, which seemed like an eternity, the county sheriff and the coroner arrived. The sheriff, a man who had worked in the police force for over 30 years and had seen everything, stopped 10 feet from the body and stared at it silently for a long time, then at the tracks, then back at the body. His face, usually stern and impenetrable, expressed a mixture of shock and disbelief. The coroner, Dr. Alan Fairburn, set to work. His preliminary examination at the scene was brief. He confirmed that death had resulted from massive trauma and decapitation. When the sheriff asked him what animal could have done such a thing, Fairburn, without taking his eyes off the wounds, replied quietly, "None that I studied in medical school." He drew the sheriff's attention to the nature of the wound on the neck. It did not resemble a clean cut left by a knife or an axe. The edges were ragged, the vertebrae shattered. It looked as if the head had been torn off rather than cut off. Soon, a forensic team arrived from the county center. They worked slowly and methodically in complete silence. They photographed every trace, every drop of blood, every scrap of clothing. They paid special attention to the footprints. Dozens of plaster casts were made, both of 2-legged and 4-legged prints. A thorough search of the area within 100 yards yielded no results. Ethan Miller's head was gone. It was never found. As the body was being taken away, one of the officers noticed something else on the trunk of a pine tree near where the broken rifle had been found at a height of about 9 feet, almost 3 meters. There were deep scratches. 3 parallel grooves had stripped away the bark and left a mark in the wood itself. He called the sheriff. The sheriff came over, looked at the scratches, and at the wounds on Miller's chest. The pattern matched. In the days that followed, investigators tried to piece together a picture of what had happened. A firearms expert who was given the remains of the Remington 700 rifle wrote in his report that such damage would require a sudden application of force, equivalent to several thousand pounds per square inch. He categorically rejected the theory that the rifle could have broken when it hit a tree during a fall. This weapon was broken, the report said, as if it had been taken by both ends and bent over a knee. Only the knee was made of steel. The autopsy report prepared by Dr. Fairburn was even more disturbing. He confirmed his initial findings. The depth of the lacerations on the chest reached 4 inches. 3 ribs were broken and pushed inward. The cause of death was listed as traumatic amputation of the head in a sealed appendix to the official report, which was not intended for the press. The coroner added, the nature of the damage to bone and muscle tissue of the cervical spine is incompatible with any known predatory animal in North America, nor does it correspond to damage caused by cutting or chopping instruments. But the main mystery remained the footprints. Plaster casts were sent to leading state biologists in the FBI's forensic laboratory. The answers that came back were discouraging. All the experts unanimously stated that these prints did not belong to any known species. It was not a bear. The shape of the foot and the position of the toes were completely different, not to mention the bipedal movement. It was not a primate. Primate tracks had never been recorded in Oregon, and the claw marks were incompatible with the anatomy of monkeys. The theory of a human hoax was also rejected, judging by the depth of the footprints in the dense, frozen snow. The creature weighed at least 400 to 500 pounds, about 200 kilograms. No human, even with specially designed snowshoes, could reproduce such pressure and such a footprint pattern. The FBI expert's conclusion was dry and concise. The origin of the tracks has not been established. Officially, the press was told that the tracks were made by an unusually large and aggressive black bear that had come out of hibernation. The Oregon Department of Natural Resources even organized a demonstration, hunt for the man-eating bear, which, of course, yielded no results. The Ethan Miller case was quietly closed, with the wording hunting accident. But in the small town surrounding Rogue River Forest, people knew it wasn't a bear. Whispers spread among the old lumberjacks, hunters, and the indigenous people of these lands, the Klamath tribe. They recalled old stories, stories their grandfathers had told. Their fathers and their fathers had told them stories about a creature that comes with the first snow, 2-legged, with the body of man, but with the head of a huge wolf or dog. It was called by many names, but the most famous was Dogman. For decades, it was considered just a local horror story, folklore fueled by random reports of strange sightings, and a famous song recorded on a local radio station back in the 80s. It was a legend for tourists and entertainment around the campfire. But after January 2007, no one laughed anymore. One of the lead investigators in the case, a detective whose name we will not mention, could not accept the official version. A few months before his transfer to another state, He wrote an internal memo to the sheriff. This document never became part of the official case file. In it, the detective refuted the bear. Theory point by point, the broken rifle, the scratches at a height of 9 feet, the anatomically impossible marks, the decapitation of the victim, and the theft of the head. At the end of his report, he wrote, "All the physical evidence we have indicates that Ethan Miller was attacked and killed by a large unknown predator, capable of both bipedal and quadrupedal movement. I cannot provide a rational explanation for this, but I am convinced that it was not a bear." That is where the official story ends. But the real story is just beginning. What happened next was a quiet, invisible war between the official version and the inconvenient truth. Ethan's widow, Laura Miller, never accepted the conclusion that it was a bear attack, in numerous but largely ignored interviews with local newspapers. She repeated the same thing. Ethan was no novice. He knew the habits of bears better than anyone. He would have heard it, smelled it. He would never have let the animal get so close. And his rifle, he cleaned it after every hunt, cared for it like a child. The idea that a bear could just break it like a twig is absurd. They're lying to me. They're lying to all of us. Her attempts to get the case reopened were met with a wall of polite but impenetrable bureaucratic refusal. The case was closed for the authorities. The story was over, but not for those who lived near the forest that winter and for several years. Afterward, fear took root in the hearts of the local community. Hunters stopped going into the forest alone. Loggers working in remote areas tried to finish their work and return to town before dark. Dozens of news stories emerged about strange howling sounds coming from the thicket at night that did not resemble the howling of wolves, about giant footprints found near frozen lakes, about domestic dogs that refused to enter the forest and cowered in fear at their owners' feet. Most of these stories were dismissed as mass hysteria fueled by the Miller tragedy, but there were too many of them to simply ignore. The detective who wrote that internal memo was transferred to Portland 6 months after the incident. Many believed this was not a promotion, but a way to remove an overly persistent truth seeker from the district. But before leaving, he gave copies of his unofficial notes and photographs of plaster cast to one person, a local journalist and regional historian who had been collecting folklore and strange stories from the region for decades. This journalist, teaming up with a retired biology professor from Willamette State University, began his own unofficial investigation. They dug through the archives and found a pattern. It turned out that every 7 to 10 years, events occurred in the region that stood out from the general picture. In 1999, 2 tourists reported to the police that at night a huge creature had tried to tear the roof off their trailer, which was parked in a forest clearing. Deep scratches remained on the aluminum paneling, similar to those found on the tree near the site of Miller's death. In 1994, a farmer found 11 of his sheep dead in the morning. They had not been eaten, only torn to pieces and scattered across the field. The veterinary service report stated, attacked by a pack of stray dogs. But the farmer himself swore until the end of his life that he had seen a dark, 2-legged silhouette on the hill that night. All these cases were isolated, dismissed as fabrications or misidentifications of animals. But now, in light of the Miller case, they formed a single frightening chain. And so, almost 5 years after the tragedy, the journalist found what became the last missing piece of this mosaic. He tracked down an old trapper, a recluse, named Frank, who lived in a remote cabin north of those places. Frank never communicated with the authorities or the press, but to the journalist who brought him food and simply sat down to talk. He finally told his story. On January 15th, 2007, the day Ethan Miller died, Frank was checking his traps. A few miles east of that very clearing. It was already getting dark. Suddenly, the silence of the forest was broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. It was not the roar of a bear or the howl of a wolf. It was a furious, guttural roar, full of primal rage. Almost immediately, it was followed by a short human scream that ended so abruptly, it was as if the person had simply been gagged. Without hesitation, Frank threw himself to the ground and crawled under the low branches of a fir tree. He lay there motionless for 10 minutes, listening. Silence returned to the forest, and then he saw movement. Between the trees, about 100 meters away, a tall, dark figure was moving. It walked on 2 legs, but its gait was strange, stooping, inhuman. The creature was huge, taller than any human Frank had ever seen. Its silhouette stood out clearly against the white snow, and the most memorable detail, the one Frank saw even in his nightmares, was the profile of its head, an elongated snout like that of a huge dog or wolf. It moved quickly and in one hand, which resembled a human hand but was covered in dark fur. It carried something dark and round. It passed by and disappeared into the thicket. Frank lay in his hiding place for another hour until it was completely dark. Then, throwing down his traps, he ran out of the forest as fast as he could. He didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me, he told the reporter. They'd lock me up in a mental hospital. But I know what I saw. The story was never published, but it explains why the authorities clung so stubbornly to the bear theory. Admitting the truth would mean admitting that the forests of the national park, popular with tourists and hunters, are home to something that has no name in zoology textbooks, something strong, intelligent, and deadly. It would cause panic that would be impossible to control. It would destroy the tourism industry of an entire region. It was easier to declare one rogue bear guilty right off the tragedy as an accident and quietly bury all the evidence. And that's what happened. The plaster casts sent for examination were lost in transit between departments. The detective's internal memo disappeared from the archives. The Ethan Miller case gathered dust on a shelf, becoming just one of many tragic stories that happen in the wild. But for those who know the details, the story is not over. It has become a grim warning, a warning that there are places where man is not the crown of creation, but merely prey. And when the sun sets in the forests of southern Oregon and the cold wind howls through the pines, locals still sometimes whisper that it's not the wind, it's the dogman going out to hunt, and no one knows where or when he'll strike next.